Celebrante came to consciousness with the uneasy sense that the world had rearranged itself while she was sleeping. The first thing she felt was heat, the deep, living warmth of another body beneath her cheek. The second was the rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't her own, steady and unhurried like a metronome in a quiet room. She lifted her head and saw that she was lying across the chest of a man whose flannel shirt smelled of pine smoke and winter wind. His face was half hidden by a russet beard, but even in drowsy confusion she noted the strong line of his jaw and the faint crescent scar near one eyebrow. Behind him a stone fireplace painted the log walls gold, and a single window framed a snowscape so white it seemed to glow. Before she could puzzle out what mountain cabin this was, or how she had arrived here, a sharper sensation punched through the fog of waking. Her own hands, sliding down the curve of her torso, met a roundness that should not have been there. Her stomach was firm and unmistakably swollen, as though months of pregnancy had condensed into a single night. Panic sparked. She scrambled upright, almost toppling from the narrow cot, and the sudden motion jolted the stranger awake. He propped himself on an elbow, blue-gray eyes focusing without alarm, and said her name in a voice that felt like an echo from a conversation she ought to remember, but could not. Sela backed toward the window, fingers splayed over her impossible midsection, every muscle poised between flight and collapse. "Who are you? Where am I? How long have I been here?" The questions tumbled out in one breath, raw and cracking at the edges. The man swung his legs over the side of the cot, palms open in a gesture both calming and heartbreakingly careful. "It's Oren. Oren Vale. You and I have been on Ember Ridge for almost a month, weathered in after that rock slide blocked the road. You don't remember because the altitude keeps hijacking your short-term memory, same way it did last week and the week before." He spoke as someone might to a patient waking from anesthesia, feeding her bits of the story at a measured pace. She wanted to shout that none of this was possible, yet the room itself conspired against denial. On a rough pine table lay her field notebook, open to pages covered in her unmistakable looping script. Lists of alpine orchids, sketches of a creek bend, and neat lines logging daily pulse readings. Beside it sat a holoslate wrapped in a scarf she recognized as her own. Her pack, tagged from a tiny Missoula airstrip, was propped under a window latch, dusted with the same fine grit that coated his boots. All proof that she had been here long enough to make herself at home, and long enough to forget it entirely. Oren rose and moved toward the hearth, keeping a respectful distance, and stirred the fire until fresh sparks darted up the chimney. The light brushed his profile in warm copper and revealed a still healing gash across his shoulder, hastily stitched. "You sewed that," he said when he saw her eyes linger. "Slid on the scree when we tried to reach the old radio tower. You called me a stubborn mule and threatened to ground tie me to the bed until the snowpack melted." He offered a wry, hesitant smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Apparently you're fond of dramatic rescues." Sela's pulse slowed, if only because her brain could not decide whether to chase panic or puzzle pieces. The baby, her baby, shifted under her palm, a flutter shockingly alive. Whatever had happened on Ember Ridge, it was written now into muscle and blood. She drew a breath deep enough that the cold air burned, then nodded once. A truce with the moment, if not yet with the man. Oren poured tea into a tin mug and set it on the table between them, an invitation rather than an order. "You said to remind you whenever this happens that trust can start over as many times as we need. So we'll start again, Sela. Ask me anything. We have all morning and nothing outside that door but snowdrifts and pine shadows." The cabin settled around them, floorboards creaking, kettle whispering, wind brushing the eaves, like a stage awaiting the next act. Sela wrapped both hands around the mug for warmth and steadied her gaze on the stranger who claimed her past and her future in a single breath. She did not know how many chapters were missing from her memory, but she understood with sudden clarity that the first task was not to recover them in a rush. It was to decide whether this new page, terrifying and inexplicably tender, was one she was willing to read aloud until the words became her own again. Sela sat at the scarred pine table while Oren tended breakfast, the silence between them thick with questions too big for a single breath. Outside, wind combed the frozen treetops, shearing tiny crystals from their branches so that daylight sifted through the window in dancing sparks. Oren's movements were deliberate but unhurried. A handful of oats poured into a dented pot, snow melted to steam on the stove, A pinch of dried huckleberries dropped in for color. He passed the bowl to her the moment she accepted that hunger felt more real than disbelief. She tasted smoke on the oats, pine needle ash that must have settled into the cast iron over years of fires. The flavor was oddly comforting, as though the cabin opened its own memory for her, since hers couldn't be trusted. Oren ate across from her, elbows on the table, eyes steady but not pressing. When she finally spoke, her first question was practical. How far they were from the nearest town. 17 miles by trail, he answered, and most of that trail was under 6 feet of avalanche debris. 2 snowmobiles had been reduced to scrap in the slide. Until the snowpack stabilized, no ranger crew would risk the switchbacks with heavy machinery. He had already tried hiking out the week before. Ice broke underfoot, and he'd turned back when a cornice fractured within earshot. Selah absorbed each fact like coordinates on a contested map. Next came the medical questions. Oren described how they'd realized the altitude was stealing her recent memories. The first episode had been brief. She woke from a nap on day 3, aware of him, but baffled by their location. By nightfall, she'd regained the missing hours. The second blackout lasted an afternoon, the third nearly a full day. After that, she started logging every sunrise and sunset, noting pulse and oxygen saturation, documenting any faint flicker of déjà vu. The entries, her script unchanging, lay in the journal before her. She opened to the most recent page. The handwriting was hurried but even, like someone racing daylight. Possible correlation. Memory drift spikes after strenuous exertion above 7,000 FT or after panic response. Recommend mindfulness breathing. Oren remains calm anchor. Reevaluate route once melt begins. Those words felt like a letter from a twin she'd never met. She swallowed a pulse of emotion and touched the ink as if it might still be warm. Then she turned the page and found a sketch of the growing child inside her, lightly shaded as though drawn in a single sitting. Beneath it she had written a name, Leora. A tiny arrow pointed from the name to a note, light after storm. Oren glanced at the sketch and smiled, small and spontaneous. You said she already has your curiosity, kicks hardest whenever the wind changes. Almost on cue, a swirl of air rattled the chimney. Selah felt a flutter under her palm, equal parts wonder and fear. The movement grounded her. Whatever her mind's condition, the life tipping inside her was incontestably real. She needed proof of the storm, of the rescue delay. Oren helped her pull on snow boots and a parka, both hers, though she could not remember buying them, and they stepped into the white glare. The cabin perched on an outcrop above a narrow valley, ridges on either side stacked like frozen waves. Down the slope yawned a scar the width of a freight train, fractured trees, churned snow, and half-buried metal ribs that had once been the radio tower. Selah recognized the tower from a conference brochure she'd written months earlier. Seeing it crumpled like paper jolted her with a fierce vertigo. She knelt, fingers tracing a shard of steel, ice burning her skin through the glove. Memory flickered, voices on the tower, Oren shouting a warning, the percussion of breaking rock. But the picture wouldn't hold. It slipped away like meltwater into a crack. Oren steadied her, hand to elbow. That's why we record, he reminded gently. He led her to a second outbuilding, a shed converted into a makeshift lab. Inside, solar lanterns glowed against mason jars packed with pressed flowers, petri dishes of fungal cultures, batteries sorted by charge. On a shelf sat a handheld Doppler. He applied gel to the probe, guided it to the curve of her belly. The cabin fell away under the echo of the baby's heartbeat, a rhythmic thrum that rewrote every anxious thought in Selah's mind. Tears stung, but she held them back, focusing instead on the monitor's numbers. 145 beats per minute. Healthy, constant, undeniable. When they returned to the cabin, Oren stoked the fire higher and unfolded a weather map across the floorboards. Jet stream models, satellite stills, avalanches plotted in red. Forecast says thaw in 9 days, he said. If the ridge holds, we can hike to the ranger outpost at Foxgate Pass. From there, Snowcat to Lolo and hospital for a full workup. He tapped another symbol, an oxygen-rich base camp they'd flagged as her safest low-altitude waypoint. Until then, low exertion, journal updates, oxygen when you feel foggy. We retell the story whenever you need. Selah studied the route, absorbing the contour lines like braille. For the first time since waking, she felt something steadier than fear. Resolve, perhaps. She set the mug aside, lifted her pen, and began a new entry dated that same morning, titled Orientation Protocol. She wrote in meticulous detail: Oren's face, the pattern of the quilt, the exact flavor of smoke-bit notes. She drew the tower wreck, annotated the weather map, and recorded Leora's heartbeat count. Then she added a line in capitals, hedging against the next blackout. If memory slips, read this page aloud with Oren. Trust the data. Trust the man. When she capped the pen and looked up, Oren was watching her with quiet relief. She realized that each time her mind had reset, he must have feared she would choose panic over partnership. The gratitude in his eyes felt too vast for words. She answered it by sliding the journal across the table for him to co-sign, a seal on their fragile treaty. Night settled early in the mountains. While wind worried the shutters, Sela lay beneath thick blankets, listening to logs hiss. Oren dozed in a chair, boots still on, shoulders sagged. Guard lowered only halfway. Leora shifted and rolled, and Sela whispered promises into the hush. She closed her eyes, repeating them like prayer. Remember the firelight. Remember the heartbeat. Remember the man who stays when the story erases. She did not know what dawn would bring, but for this one night she felt certain the cabin would still be there, the journal still open, and her own name still stitched to a future that had not existed the day before. Sela woke in the blue hush that precedes dawn, the kind of half-light that can trick a mind into thinking time has paused. And for a too long breath, she could not recall why the rafters above her head were rough-hewn, nor why the air smelled faintly of pine tar and smoke. A flicker of panic rose. She felt along the mattress for her journal, the tether she had sworn to keep within reach. But before fear formed into terror, her hand brushed a folded quilt that carried the outline of Oren's body warmth. Memory slid back into place in small, precise pieces. The wildfire crackle of the hearth, the ruined radio tower, the journal entry labeled Orientation Protocol, the steady gallop of Leora's heartbeat echoing through a Doppler speaker. She rolled onto her side and studied the man who had become both witness and archivist of her fractured timeline. Oren slept in the armchair, chin tucked, a half-read paperback balanced on his thigh. The fire had burned low, and his breath made short clouds in the unheated corner. For once he looked unguarded. Lashes dark against wind-chafed skin, mouth softened from its usual line of vigilance. Sela pushed the quilt aside, boots muffled by wool socks, and crept to the hearth to rebuild the flames before the cabin surrendered its night-hoarded heat. She knelt, coaxing tinder to life, and as sparks caught, she whispered a thank you into the cedar smoke. Gratitude to the mountain, to the man, to the unknown slice of fate that had stranded them before her condition could endanger the baby somewhere. Far less forgiving. When the kettle began its low hum, she heard sheets rustle. Oren straightened, combing hair from his eyes with fingers still nicked from yesterday's wood cutting. He looked first to her, then, automatic, to the journal that lay on the table. She answered the unspoken question by tapping the notebook's spine. "Still me," she said, and a tremor of relief loosened his shoulders. They shared oatmeal perfumed with cinnamon scavenged from the last ration tin, and Sela recited the bullet points of her memory to prove continuity. She remembered their forecast, 9 days until melt. She remembered the route sketched along the valley floor. She remembered that Leora's heartbeat sat steady at 145. After breakfast, Oren proposed they check the South Solar Array, half buried after the recent squall. Sela agreed, knowing routine tasks were anchors and knowing too that exercise at altitude demanded strict pacing. She layered thermal leggings beneath her maternity trousers and tugged on a blue knit cap she did not recall knitting, but that fit as though her past self had measured every contour of her skull. Outside, the world dazzled. Sunlight ricocheted off snow crystals that had frozen midair when last night's wind crashed into colder layers. The ridge to the east looked painted in powdered sugar, almost delicate, belying the thousands of tons of ice it carried. The solar array stood waist-deep in drifted snow, panels tilted like broken wings. Selah and Oren worked shoulder to shoulder, using avalanche shovels to carve a trench so the panels could catch midday light. Every few minutes he paused, pointed 2 fingers at her, a silent query about dizziness. She answered with a brief OK sign until an unexpected wave of vertigo forced her to plant the shovel and close her eyes. Air thinned too quickly. She remembered from the journal not to panic, dragged slow breaths through her nose, and signaled for the canister tucked in Oren's pack. He fitted the oxygen mask over her mouth, tightened the strap with a tenderness that did not embarrass them anymore, and counted her inhalations until color crept back into her cheeks. The lapse lasted 3 minutes, but the protocol held. Memory did not crumble. They logged the episode on a palm-sized voice recorder, code word Cinder, then finished clearing the snow. On the hike back, they followed a game trail that skirted the canyon lip, boots squeaking on sunsoft crust. As they walked, Sela quizzed Oren about details she had never thought to record. The scar on his brow, splitted on a steel gate at 10 while racing a neighbor's horse. The meaning of the tattoo just above his wrist, coordinates for a marsh where his mother taught him to fish. He countered by asking about the first plant that ever fascinated her. She told him how, at 7, she'd found a desert mariposa lily blooming in a roadside ditch after a monsoon and had been stunned to learn beauty could hide in places cars sped past at 70 miles an hour. The story made him smile. He confessed he had fallen in love with her exactly the moment she knelt in the mud beside a snowmelt seep and gasped like a child on Christmas because she'd spotted a single ghost orchid petal caught on a branch. Back in the cabin, she transcribed everything into the journal. Scar story, marsh coordinates, desert lily memory, locking the day's growth where tomorrow's self could not doubt its authenticity. Mid-afternoon clouds rolled high and thin, turning the light silver. Oren suggested they watch one of the holoslate files she had avoided, a clip titled Equinox Laugh. Sela hesitated, uncertain if more missing footage would comfort or disorient, but curiosity edged out fear. The projection filled the room with color. It showed them on the cabin porch weeks earlier, sun nearly straight above, snow still pristine. Sela in the video was reading aloud from a botanical guide, stumbling over hyper-Latin syllables while Oren tried to mimic her accent and failed so badly she collapsed into laughter. Huge, unguarded, goose-honking bursts that shook her shoulders. Watching herself laugh, Salah felt tears prick. Her current self had carried so much vigilance that genuine hilarity seemed like another person's privilege. Oren lowered the slate volume and said softly, "That's still in you. Even if you can't always reach it on command?" She nodded, swallowed hard, wrote a note to tomorrow. "Remember, you laugh like thunder, full-bodied and ridiculous." Before dusk, Oren checked the barometer and frowned. A pressure dip hinted at new weather. They trimmed extra wood, filled water jugs from melting roof runoff, and double-wrapped the greenhouse tray where Oren tended his seedling orchids. Micro-propagated backups he refused to let frost claim. Sela brewed ginger tea against altitude nausea and sat cross-legged near the hearth with a stack of blank index cards. On each she printed a single memory anchor, as therapists once taught amnesia patients. Leora heartbeat, journal first, oxygen if dizzy, trust Oren. She punched a hole and strung them on parachute cord, slipped the necklace over her head like a talisman. Wind rose after dark, moaning through chinks. They ate bean stew in near silence, both listening for subtle groans in the roof. When the fire settled to embers, Oren unrolled a second sleeping mat beside the cot, unwilling to leave her side during the storm. Sela rested on her left flank, hand cupping the curve that sheltered their daughter, and told him she was afraid of waking to find the cards meant nothing. He touched the necklace, fingers brushing hers, and said memory was only one way the brain stored love. The body knew older languages. If she forgot, he would teach them again. Heartbeat, laughter, the mulled spice scent that rose from her hair when she stood too close to the fire. Snow began sometime after midnight, that heavy velvet kind that muffles axe blows and heartbeats alike. Sela drifted between dreams, a mariposa lily opening on hot desert glass, a radio tower collapsing in slow clarity, Oren's scar unzipping like a road on a map. Each image blurred but did not vanish, as though the therapy of oxygen and routine had woven a net fine enough to catch at least the edges of memory. She surfaced near dawn, rooms silvered with new light, and panic did not surge. She knew the roofline, the pine tar smoke, the gentle rasp of Oren's breathing. Her hand found the necklace of memory cards, and she read the first without needing to turn the lantern brighter. Lyra stretched beneath her ribs, a ripple greeting. Sela smiled, rubbed the place where a tiny heel pressed, and whispered that the world outside their ridge was enormous and messy but worth trusting. Because trust could be rebuilt one card, one clip, one shared bowl of smoky oats at a time. She lay there listening to the baby's quiet aquatic tumble and felt, if not certainty, a workable blueprint. Follow the steps, make new notes, keep breathing the thin air until the trail thawed and a ranger's snowcat appeared like a miracle on the horizon. Memory might falter again, probably would, but she finally believed the story would hold, because a stranger was a stranger only the first time. Orin would be there to remind her, and she would relearn him. And each relearning would plant the bond deeper, roots thickening beneath the snow. Snow fell for 3 days without pausing, the kind of relentless, fine-grained storm that swallowed the world in hush and glare at the same time. At first, Sella and Orin leaned into their practiced rhythm, firewood, oxygen checks, pages logged in the journal. But by the second morning, even Orin's sure-footed confidence began to flicker. Drifts climbed halfway up the windows, dimming the cabin to an underwater gloom. The path to the outbuilding disappeared beneath an undulating blanket that shifted with every gust, erasing footprints almost before they were made. Light diffused through the snowpack like milk, so neither of them could be certain when dawn arrived, or whether the sun bothered to crest the ridge at all. The cabin became a snow cave threaded with the smell of cedar smoke, babying a pocket of warmth in an indifferent wilderness. When the barometer's needle dipped below any reading Sella had logged before, Orin unrolled the topographic map and traced an alternate route, a switchback-free line down a western saddle that should, in theory, accumulate less avalanche risk. Their original plan, a straightforward descent to Foxgate Pass, now looked suicidal. The slope that held the wrecked radio tower was groaning under the record weight. Every tree bowed into shapes that whispered of impending fracture. From the hearth, Sella watched him redraw the path, his pencil traveling across contour lines with steady pressure, as though the graphite were not merely marking paper, but transmuting fear into geometry. She had come to understand that Orin fought chaos by translating it into sketches, directions, weight calculations. She fought it by writing and rewriting sensory detail, sound of the window rattle, tang of iron in the meltwater they boiled, exact texture of Leora's last flutter. Between them, ink and graphite built a scaffold inside which sanity could roost. Late on the second night, the stove coughed soot into the room. Orin threw open the damper to test the draw, but no flame brightened. Somewhere above, the chimney must have clogged with a plug of ice. Without immediate correction, the cabin would fill with smoke and carbon monoxide. They both understood the hazard without speaking it. Orin hauled on his wettest parka and climbed the roof ladder embedded in the eaves. Sella stood below, aiming the lantern beam upward, the light carving a tunnel through snowflakes so dense they looked like sifted flour. She heard Orin shove the stovepipe cap with a gloved hand, metal groaning in protest, then a low shout as he wrenched it free, and a torrent of gritty ice cascaded to the ground. He came down coated in shards that glittered like mica in the lantern glare. While he banged the soot from his sleeves, he flashed her a smile she recognized as bravado, the kind that valued reassurance over truth. Inside the cabin, Sella brewed tea spiked with ginger syrup. Orin sat close enough to the hearth that the firelight revealed tremors in his hands. Adrenaline, she guessed, the aftershock of climbing in blizzard conditions. When she offered the mug, he thanked her with a brush of knuckles across her wrist. The simple warmth of that touch pierced the chill more effectively than the tea. He asked how her oxygen felt. She did a slow inhale test, then shook her head, clear. But a low headache had begun behind her eyes, and she made a note of it anyway. By midday of the third storm day, the stew pot was reduced to thin broth, and the crate of split logs counted only 7 pieces. They rationed heat to a single blaze at dusk, sleeping in double-layered quilts during the day to conserve calories. Orin recalled an emergency cache of supplies buried near the Ghost Orchid Glade, a mile down slope, but admitted sledding back uphill pregnant was impossible, and leaving her alone in a memory-fragile state violated every rule they had drafted. Together, the conversation stalled, both of them weighing risk against risk until the wind slammed a branch against the roof and broke the stalemate. Orin announced he would go at first light. Sella vetoed, pointing out that first light no longer existed. The mountain trapped in a monochrome dawn and dusk stretched thin. Instead, they compromised. They would make the journey together, but only if the snow softened and visibility improved. She recorded the plan on her card necklace, so next day Sella would never be startled to find herself on a winter track. Sleep that night came fitful. Sella dreamed of walking above treeline, every step crackling on crusts that shattered like glass. She carried Leora in her arms, not her belly, and the baby's fingers clutched a slipped petal orchid that glowed faintly blue, illuminating the snow with an inner light. When she woke toward morning, twilight sagging against iced panes, she sensed difference in the air. The wind had died. The cabin felt muffled but not shaking, and a subtle pale amber hue seeped under the door, sunrise sneaking through a ragged gap in the cloud deck. She slid from bed, quelling the tight muscles in her lower back, checked her memory anchors. All held. Oren snored softly, arm flung over the notebook. She didn't wake him until she confirmed the stovepipe clear and the headache gone. At breakfast, they declared the storm's lull a departure window. Both donned snowshoes, lashed a small sled with rope, packed it with a single oxygen tank, the Doppler, 2 blankets, emergency rations, and Oren's avalanche beacons. Selah looped her card necklace over the parka where she could see it. He tested each beacon frequently enough that the sound, 2 chirps, pause, became a counterpoint to their breathing. The snowfield glittered under newborn sunshine, crusted but not yet wind-hardened, giving way just enough to anchor the crampons without knee-deep collapse. Selah focused on cadence, matching steps to mantra. Sled pull left, breath in, card 1 trust Oren, breath out, sled pull right. Halfway down the ravine, a snow shelf cracked like splitting timber. The fracture line shot forward in eerie silence before the slab peeled away. Slow motion at first, then rushing down slope in a roar. Oren yanked Selah behind a rock spine just as the mass thundered past, pulverizing fir saplings like straw. Powder clouds billowed over them, coating goggles in white frost, but the slide veered east, sparing their path. When the noise dwindled to a hush of settling debris, Selah discovered her necklace had been torn loose, cards strewn across the new snow. She knelt to gather them, but Oren gripped her elbow. Leave them, the slope might still move. She hesitated, heart slamming, afraid the next blankout would come without anchors. Oren's eyes met hers, steady as the heartbeat she carried. You didn't forget through 3 days of storm, Selah. You won't forget now just because the cards are gone. She believed him, maybe because belief itself had become a muscle she was learning to exercise. They reached the orchid glade under a hard noon sky. Drifts banked high against the tree trunks, but the cache marker, a weathered survey pole, jutted free. Oren shoveled through wind slab until the hatch appeared. Inside, they found sealed food packs, fuel canisters, and, to Selah's surprise, a second Doppler monitor she hadn't realized existed. She inventoried supplies aloud for the recording device while he repacked, distributing weight for the uphill pull. Before sealing the hatch, he removed a small parcel wrapped in wax cloth, dried orchid root powder, and a pneumatic injector. Your neurologist said if the amnestic spiral triggers a seizure, 2 clicks in the thigh. His voice was careful, non-alarmist. She nodded, tucked it into her parka, aware of its bulk like a promise against the skin. The ascent proved harder, the air thinner, afternoon light glaring off every slope. Twice, Selah forced pauses, leaning on poles, gulping oxygen from the tank while Oren murmured field facts to distract her. Thermal stress tolerance in lichens, feather architecture in snowshoe hares. Repetition grounded her better than silence. When cabin smoke curled into view at last, dusk was already pinking the western ridge. Inside, they celebrated with reconstituted vegetable soup thickened by Oren's last potato, sliced wafer-thin to trick the mouth into luxury. Selah wrote a fresh orientation entry, narrating the slide, the lost cards, the successful retrieval of supplies. She ended with one new bolded line. If the cards are gone, memory still lives. Her hand didn't tremble as she wrote it. Oren watched each letter form and nodded approval. Exhaustion hit in a wave. She lay down intending to rest for a minute and slid into dreamless sleep. When she woke, dawn glowed again, snow diamond bright, and panic fluttered. Had she lost yesterday? But her hand found the journal on her chest, open to the bold sentence. She remembered the slide, the survey pole, Oren's protective shout. She remembered choosing to leave the cards behind. Relief burst so intense she laughed aloud, waking Oren. He lifted his head, hair sticking wild, and smiled at the sound. Over oatmeal, he asked if she noticed anything different. She realized she couldn't recall last night's temperature reading or how many cups of soup she'd ladled, but the shape of time, the essential thread, remained intact. Neurologists would call it partial consolidation. Oren called it hope. She reached across the table and drew his hand to her belly so Leora's morning kicks thumped against his palm. "We're getting close," she said, meaning the melt, the descent, the hospital, and something more. This fragile turn from survival to living. Outside, the ridge gleamed under a sun no longer hidden by storm fronts, and meltwater dripped rhythmic as a clock from the eaves. They opened the door wide, letting the cabin breathe. Sela inhaled the scent of thawing earth and saw not a trap but a threshold. The mountain would still test them, but the story no longer belonged only to memory. It belonged to intention, written in a journal, carved in the snowfield path they had survived together. Sunlight poured into the cabin at a slant that belonged to early April, brushing every rough board with the color of wheat and awakening scents the snow had buried for months. Resin, raw sap, the faint musk of earth beginning to breathe under its icy blanket. Sela stood in the open doorway and watched rivulets snake down from the roof in silver threads. They leapt from the eaves, struck a saddle of old snow, and burrowed inward, carving miniature canyons that bluebirds kept trying to drink from before the channels vanished. Somewhere between night and morning, the temperature had risen just high enough to verge uncomfortable. The ridge still shimmered in armor, but armor, she realized, can melt. Oren emerged from the shed, lugging a pair of lightweight backcountry sleds he had cobbled together from plastic signboard and scavenged ski bindings. Each sled fit inside the other in nesting fashion, lashed with paracord and two climbing skins to provide uphill grip. He set them on the porch like gifts from some eccentric Santa and wiped sweat from his brow. "They'll track better than the wide freight sled," he said, though she could see he'd already tested them. Fine scratches marred the undersides. He had been out before she woke, running the prototypes along the first switchback to be sure the bindings wouldn't pop. The realization that he'd done so alone, a calculated risk given her memory, felt like both trust and declaration. The mountain was changing, and so must their rules. Inside the cabin, the journal lay open to the orientation entry she'd penned last night. The bold line, "If the cards are gone, memory still lives," looked less like a safety net now, and more a motto, resilient as the spring thaw. She added a fresh paragraph detailing the sled designs and the thickness of the melt crust, then shut the book without a flicker of dread. When she turned, Oren was kneeling beside the fireplace, fitting the last of their camp stove canisters into a stuff sack. He held up a roll of marking tape, fluorescent orange. "Trailblazes," he said. "If the weather flips, we follow these back by headlamp." He passed her the roll. "Your call on where they go." The choreography of departure began in earnest. Salah strapped their last oxygen bottle onto the smaller sled with two bungees, tucked the Doppler monitor into a dry bag wrapped in wool, sliced protein bars into bite-sized pieces so she could eat without removing her mittens. Oren checked the avalanche beacons twice, then a third time, pronouncing their batteries good for 40 hours. Plenty of margin. They donned the cardio-respiratory monitors they had rigged from an old climbing kit. If either heart rate spiked beyond the threshold, the other's unit pulsed a soft alarm. It was prophylaxis against amnesia for her and altitude hypoxia for him, a mirrored safeguard. Before sealing the cabin door, Oren produced a charcoal pencil and wrote 2 lines on the inside plank. "Left with spring, back with summer." S&O and Leora, of course. Sela traced the ampersand with a gloved finger, then pressed her palm flat over the unborn child, who had begun staking territory beneath her ribs. Leora kicked in reply, as if approving the inscription. They stepped outside, locked the hasp, and seated themselves on the sleds. Oren in front towing the heavier load, Sela behind with the medical kit, all momentum aimed toward the river valley far below. The first 2 kilometers followed familiar terrain, their old supply path. Snowshoes bit through a crust thick enough to carry half a body, but fickle enough to collapse on the sudden. When slabs crunched, they spread their weight, waiting until the fracture hiss subsided. Sela, who once feared each misstep might cost her memories, now narrated quietly for her recorder. Type of snow, slope angle, pulse rate. Reflection steadied her feet better than caution alone. At the large bend, where the supply trail veered east toward the radio tower's gorge, they turned west instead, onto untested ground. The saddle Oren had mapped rose in a long ramp, forest on the left, a sheer drop on the right where skeletal pines leaned out over nothing. The sun had climbed high, bright enough that the snow's surface streamed vapor, yet air temperature remained just below freezing, ideal conditions for bridging over hidden boulders. Oren set a patient pace, measuring strides to her breathing. They stopped at a copse of spruces to sip from the shared hydration pouch and to listen. The mountain spoke in sporadic booms, distant cornices collapsing far from their chosen corridor. Mid-afternoon, clouds massed along the western peaks like dark parchment about to be ink-soaked. Shadows lengthened prematurely. Sela's pulse monitor toggled amber. She felt lightheaded. Immediately, they switched protocol. Oren staked the sleds, clipped her to the oxygen hose, and had her recline against a pack while he scouted 50 yards ahead for safe bivy options. She counted breaths, 8 slow draws, and felt the fog recede. When he returned, he carried a grin and a chunk of dark lichen he'd chipped from a rock. "Turns out your ghost orchid isn't the only survivor species," he said, folding the fragile specimen into a sample vial. Humor edged the worry from his eyes. She kissed his mittened knuckles, an instinctive gesture that neither commented on. They pressed on, cresting the saddle just as the cloud bank ruptured into thin curtains of grupple. Visibility shrank, but the topography eased, a gentle downward slope spotted with young firs too small to avalanche. As snow pelted their jackets like thrown rice, Sela tapped her chest monitor twice, the all-clear signal they'd borrowed from their older Morse. Oren mirrored the taps on his own sternum, a totem of connection. He had used the same code the night he told her he loved her, recorded on the holoslate, tap-tap, pause, tap-tap, as if encoding an unbreakable checksum into the file of their life. By dusk, the saddle funneled into the upper basin of Coal Creek. Sela recognized landmarks only from the map. The basalt monolith shaped like a preacher's pulpit, the snarl of sycamores twisted by historic mudslides. Seeing them turned cartography into reassurance. Their descent plotted lines on the earth instead of just inside their heads. Yet exhaustion seeped through every layer of clothing. They pitched a minimalist tarp between 2 rock shoulders, weighted its flapping edges with snow-filled dry bags. Underneath, they unfurled a single sleeping pad against radiant heat loss, backs pressed together for mutual warmth, boots still on in case the mountain demanded an overnight retreat. Wind rattled nylon through the long hours. Sela drifted between half-dreams of research labs and neon-lit hospital corridors where ultrasound screens flashed stock ticker streams of fetal variables. Each time she startled awake, she found Oren's breathing a steady anchor, and each time she touched her belly, she felt Leora's answering nudge. At one point, sleet turned to gentle snow, padding the tarp so thickly that silence fell sudden as sleep. She woke before dawn to a rare gift. Stars gnawed holes in the storm's remnants, and the sky was a well of indigo rinsed clean. They dug out, reheated a freeze-dried mushroom risotto whose taste exceeded neither's expectations, but offered salt and calories. The valley floor lay 2 kilometers ahead, a mosaic of blue spruce, stone, and the sinuous line of Coal Creek barely audible under ice. Sela's legs trembled from the previous day's mileage. Oren shifted heavier weight to the front sled without hesitation. No heroics, she thought, just logistics. The man met every problem first as a puzzle before he let emotion touch it. Closer to tree line, the snow softened until the sleds bogged. They abandoned them under a tarp marked with fluorescent tape and transferred essentials to packs. Oxygen, Doppler, the orchid root injector, and Oren's battered field knife. The ground beneath the snow was glassy with underlying ice. They crabbed sideways for purchase, following the faint gurgle of the creek. Eventually, the snowcap thinned into patchy crust and then to bare ground. Rock woolly with moss, mud smeared by moose tracks, delicate shoots of avalanche lily piercing through. Sela bent and touched the first flower, pale petal tipped with blush, marveling that life had threaded forward on schedule regardless of human intrigues. An hour later, they rounded a bend and saw it. The ranger outpost at Foxgate Pass, a squat timber building with a green metal roof, smoke curling from its chimney. A radio mast rose beside it, intact. For an instant, neither moved, as if a single step might fracture the mirage. Then Oren exhaled a ragged laugh, and Sela found herself running, stumbling, half sliding down the last slope, though her lungs burned. A burly ranger burst from the doorway, coat flapping, shouting incongruous words about black coffee and satellite phones. Sela's knees buckled. Oren caught her from behind, arms locking around her torso. Together they crossed the threshold, where a crackling wood stove blasted away months of chill in a single wave. Inside, everything smelled of kerosene and wet wool. The ranger, name-tag Burris, pressed a mug into her hands, flipped on a flood lamp to check pupils, jabbered about medevac choppers rerouted after the radio outage. Oren relayed coordinates, weather logs, Sella's medical status. Sella let their voices fade into a comforting blur, and instead focused on the mug's warmth seeping into her fingers. She pressed its rim to her belly, inviting Leora to feel the heat of rescue. Boris radioed the regional dispatch. Static crackled back, then a dispatcher's clear, surprised voice. They'd been monitoring for days, expecting silence. A helicopter could depart within the hour. Weather cooperative. Salah looked at Oren. Wonder collided with fatigue in his expression. She recognized that he too had lived at the edge of capacity, but now a new phase approached, one with more people, more systems, but perhaps less clarity. She wasn't frightened. The journal, the bold sentence, the cardiorespiratory monitors all belonged to the ridge phase. The next season would demand its own safeguards. While Burris arranged their extraction, Oren untied the scarf around Sella's neck, and with a pen from the ranger's desk, wrote 2 taps and a dot on the fabric corner. The new shorthand for "We survived." Never mind how. He tied it back gently. She reached up, touched the symbol, and smiled, noting without terror how easily memory retrieved its meaning. Then she opened her journal one more time, though her hand shook so much the pen scratched, and wrote a final entry under the heading "Valley Floor." She described the avalanche lilies. She noted her pulse at the moment of sighting the outpost. She recorded Leora's strong kick when heat kissed her skin. Last, she wrote a line with no practical value but one she wanted tomorrow, and every tomorrow to find. Love is not the memory, love is the relearning, and relearning is forever. A rotor thump echoed against the valley walls. Snowflakes skittered along the window from the downwash. Sella closed the journal. Oren shouldered their pack. Together they stepped back into the cold, ready to trade mountain silence for rotor roar, ready to trust that the story would travel intact because they would carry it, not in flawless recall, but in the willingness to retell it aloud as often as life asked. The helicopter lifted from Foxgate Pass with a judder that rattled every window in the ranger station. As the skids cleared the snowpack, white powder exploded beneath the rotors, swirling into an ethereal vortex that swallowed the cabin trail and the sled tracks they had carved through the basin. Sella watched the scene shrink, roofline, smoking chimney, the bent sycamores at the verge of melt, until it all collapsed into a single white smudge on the mountainside. Her heart jolted at the sight of disappearance, but Oren's hand tightened around hers, anchoring her against a wave of vertigo. The cabin had been their crucible and their cage. Now it became a memory liable to dissipate unless they curated it carefully. Inside the medevac craft, the world was all aluminum and anxious vibration. A paramedic named Jessa clipped Sella's oxygen mask in place, hung an IV pouch, and threaded the line into a vein with swift competence. The monitor at Sella's shoulder displayed twin graphs, her own heart rate, and an amplified tracing of Leora's. Both spikes settled into shared cadence. Oren sat opposite, knees braced to the stretcher frame, eyes never leaving Sella's. He had acquiesced to the paramedic's brisk orders, coat swapped for a fleece blanket, vitals taken, altitude pills administered. Yet beneath every medical protocol remained the private vigilance he'd carried since the first blackout on Ember Ridge. The pilot banked hard around a ridge finger, and the arc of the valley unfurled in sudden, sunlit clarity. Fractured cornices glinting like silver daggers, coal-colored pines tufted with fresh snow, and in the far distance a ribbon of road snaking toward Lolo Pass, the first man-made line Sella had seen in weeks. She breathed through the oxygen and whispered key coordinates from memory. Foxgate exit to Lolo, Lolo to Missoula Clinic, as if naming them guaranteed safe arrival. At Missoula Regional, orderlies rolled Sella into an elevator that smelled of disinfectant and lemon polish. She flashed on the Boston elevator where her and Oren's story had begun. Metal walls mute witnesses to a stranger turning into a partner. This elevator, though, rose with functional indifference. Only hospital chimes for soundtrack. On the maternity floor, a triage nurse clipped a plastic bracelet on her wrist. Bronte, Sella, obstetrics high risk. Oren received a visitor badge but refused to sit in the waiting room. He hovered at the intake desk until a senior resident, appreciating stubborn love when she saw it, waved him past the swinging doors. Ultrasound gel, warm from a water bath, spread over Salah's belly. The screen bloomed in grayscale, vertebrae like pearls on a string, a perfect semicircle of skull, two fists pressed to cheeks. The tech froze the image, measured crown rump length, toggled Doppler, and the exam room filled with the rush of fetal blood flow, a percussive river. Lyra kicked at the probe, and the tech grinned. She's feisty, and on the big side for her gestational age, she reported. Looks like the mountains agreed with her. A neurologist followed, reading Sella's Ridge journal with professional fascination. He ordered a battery of cognitive tests, name recall, spatial orientation, serial subtraction, while nurses drew blood to check oxygen saturation and metabolic panels. Sella completed the task with only one stumble on the date, confusing April 9th with 8th. The neurologist, Dr. Kavanaugh, nodded, noting excellent consolidation given recent hypoxic stress. She recommended hyperbaric oxygen therapy to accelerate neuronal recovery, plus a specialized peptide infusion derived from the ghost orchids. Clinical trial fast-tracked, thanks to Sella's own prior research. Oren exhaled a laugh that sounded half amazed, half relieved. The very plant that drew Sela into the wilderness would help carry her safely back into full memory. That first night in the ward brought sensory overload. Machines beeped, intercoms chirped, fluorescent lights hummed. Salah's mind, tuned to mountain quietude, rebelled. Oren dimmed every lamp he could find, closed hallway blinds, and played a recording of Pine Wind from his phone. He relocated a spare cot to her bedside and, despite a nurse's raised eyebrow, laid his jacket across the mattress so the smell of wood smoke and cedar would anchor them both. In the morning, Dr. Kavanaugh returned with a tablet displaying an MRI scan. The hippocampal region showed minor swelling, typical of altitude encephalopathy, but expected to resolve. Still, she warned, another prolonged hypoxic episode might leave lasting deficits. No elevations above 5,000 feet until after delivery, she said firmly, then softened. That includes any thought of hiking back to say goodbye to the cabin. Sela nodded, already missing the silence of snow, but she pressed a hand to her belly and accepted the boundary. Oren squeezed her shoulder, promising they could retrieve their belongings after snowmelt with ranger escort. For now, the focus was stabilization and planning the birth away from any terrain that could sabotage her mind again. Hyperbaric sessions began. Salah lying in a clear acrylic chamber, oxygen saturating tissues under gentle pressure. Each 90-minute dive left her sleepy but sharpened the edges of cognition. After 3 treatments, she could recite every step of the river slog. Picture the avalanche lilies. Recall the moment Oren wrote their promise on the cabin door. She asked him to write it again, this time in ink, on the inside cover of her journal. He added the date and a tiny doodle of 3 pine trees, their forest, their timeline, their family of almost 3. The neurologist cleared her for short walks. Oren guided her through hospital corridors lined with paintings of Montana prairies. At a lobby window, they watched April rain replace mountain snow. Sela realized the world was trading white silence for color. Emerald lawns, amber traffic lights, the jittery red of neon outside a diner across the street. She felt alive and overwhelmed in equal measure. Oren sensed it and suggested they start curating a new set of memory anchors that belonged to low-altitude life. The scent of espresso from the volunteer cafe, the texture of city pavement under wheels of commuters' bicycles, the pattern of raindrops on tinted glass. They filled pages together, titling them Urban Orientation, drawn in the same bold hand as the cabin notes. One afternoon, while Oren fetched coffee, Sela's obstetrician, Dr. Amaya, arrived with chart in hand and eyes alight. The latest ultrasound showed Lior had rotated head down, readying for birth despite being only 34 weeks. It's early but within normal, Dr. Amaya assured her. She's healthy, lungs maturing nicely. Sela felt Leora tumble inside and place the Doppler earbud against her skin just to hear that reliable whoosh whoosh, a metronome of progress. Evenings in the ward became a ritual of stories. Oren read aloud from Sela's own field notebooks. Tales of plants surviving improbable altitudes, of lichens harnessing ultraviolet radiation, of orchids blooming from charred soil after wildfire. Each vignette served as parable. Obstacle becoming adaptation. Between entries, he confessed his fears, how each blackout had stolen a little of his confidence. how he sometimes rehearsed introducing himself anew while she slept. Selah confessed her own dread, that she might awaken postpartum with no memory of labor, no recognition of her child. They vowed to record Leora's birth in every medium, video, audio, tactile mementos, layered redundancy against forgetfulness. May crept closer, and with it the neon sign of a motel across from the hospital began to flicker in pastel hues. Selah joked it heralded warmer weather. Oren said it looked like the northern lights retired to a small town. On a mild evening 1 week before her 35th week, Selah's water broke while she performed a seated breathing exercise. The room flooded with urgent calm, nurses snapping gloves, Oren pressing the call button, Dr. Amaya arriving mid-stride. Labor progressed quickly. Selah wrote each contraction with mountain-honed focus, inhaling on the memory of cedar sap, exhaling on the echo of avalanche lilies opening at dawn. Oren coached, reminding her that she'd once stitched his shoulder in a snowstorm. She could endure this too. Hospital clocks ticked beyond perception until a final push and a wet cry fractured the tension. Lyra Vale Bronte emerged pink, furious, perfect. Dr. Amaya placed her on Salah's chest, and the world telescoped to the weight of 7 pounds and a beating heart against her own. Someone, maybe Oren, captured the moment on the holoslate, but Selah barely registered the camera. She traced the tiny shell of Leora's ear and whispered hello in a voice hoarse with wonder. Oren touched Leora's fist, then Selah's crown, tears bright as meltwater in his beard. He tapped her wrist twice. Tap, tap. Pause, tap. The code for stay. Selah answered the same against Leora's blanket-swaddled back. The nurse clipped a bracelet around the baby's ankle. Selah smiled, realizing their daughter's first ID band mirrored her own. When dawn slid across the floor tiles, Selah lay awake, afraid to sleep lest memory steal this hour. She wrote everything, feel of damp curls under her chin, citrus bite of disinfectant, Oren humming off-key lullabies until hand cramped. She tucked the journal under her pillow like a bedtime story. Before closing her eyes, she whispered to Leora, who slept in a plastic bassinet inches away, that mountains could take memory, but could not take essence. And essence was what mothers handed down. The days that followed blurred strangely, equal parts milk, chart rounds, discharge lessons. Yet memory held, anchored by routine and oxygen-rich sleep and perhaps the neurological whisper of orchid peptides. 3 days postpartum, Dr. Kavanagh cleared her for discharge with a caveat. Cognitive rest, no travel above 5,000 feet for 6 months, regular neuro follow-ups. Selah promised compliance. Oren signed forms with a new occupancy. Guardian of Leora Vale Bronte. They left the hospital under a sky scrubbed clean by spring rain. The motel sign glowed steady pink, no longer glitching. Selah strapped Leora into a car seat far too large for her fragile limbs and whispered apologies for the world's vastness. Oren adjusted mirrors, started the truck, and aimed down the boulevard. They had found a rental cottage on the fringe of Missoula, walking distance to coffee and bookstores, altitude a safe 3,200 feet. It smelled of juniper and faint old dust, but the windows were wide and the backyard held a maple already bursting with red buds. After settling the baby, they unfolded Selah's journal on a kitchen table still gritty with sawdust from recent renovations. She titled a new section Lowland Chapter 1. Oren added the date, and beneath it he wrote, "We made it from ice to melt to birth. Tomorrow remember how daylight tastes on maple buds." Leora fussed, and Selah lifted her, heart aching at the miracle that this memory would persist. Not frozen like snowpack, but alive, self-healing, much like the orchids that had saved both mind and journey. Night settled mild and fragrant. While the baby slept, Oren brewed tea, and Selah closed her eyes in a room lit by street lamps instead of moon on snow. For the first time since Ember Ridge, she allowed sleep to come without fear of waking blank. If morning erased a detail, she had backups upon backups, digital, inked, whispered, sung. But she suspected the most potent safeguard was simply that life, like the metaplast alloy, had learned to fuse shut every wound until what remained was a faint seam and a story of survival stronger than the break. Beyond the open window, rain resumed in gentle rhythm, tapping the roof in a Morse code only 2 mountain survivors and their newborn daughter could truly translate. May ripened into June with the lazy confidence of a college town between semesters, and Missoula's streets filled with the scent of lilacs and fresh asphalt patchwork. In the rental cottage, Sela discovered that low-altitude life unfolded in micro-episodes very different from the mountain's epic acts. Instead of gauging sky pressure, she learned to read the subtle forecasts of an infant. The tremor of Leora's chin that meant hunger, the half-growl that signaled impending sleep, the wide-eyed marvel that followed every new color she glimpsed through. The porch screen. Oren, who had once timed his existence to barometric graphs, now measured days by diaper changes and the intervals at which he could coax a gurgling laugh from their daughter. The neurologist's restrictions, no elevation, no mental overexertion, felt at first like a smaller cage than the cabin. Salah obeyed meticulously, walking loops around the neighborhood with a stroller whose wheels squeaked on cracked sidewalks. She carried a fresh notebook labeled Urban Orientation, and in it she logged details as diligently as she had on Ember Ridge. The bakery where cardamom rolls left a sugar blossom on the air at 7:30 sharp. The bus route whose diesel growl passed exactly 9 steps after the walk signal chirped. The mural of camas lilies blooming blue against a brick wall. These were memory anchors for a brain still knitting itself whole. Each evening she recited them to Oren, who added his own city discoveries. The barista at Black Coffee who sneaked him extra espresso shots. The bridge trusses that hummed B-flat when semis thundered across. 2 weeks after discharge, Dr. Kavanagh introduced the first home infusion of the orchid peptide therapy. Sela sat at the kitchen table, Leora drowsing in a sling, while a visiting nurse guided a catheter into her arm. The medication ran cool and metallic under her skin, leaving a faint floral aftertaste at the back of her throat. Side effects were mild, just a buzzing in her temples and an hour of heightened clarity so sharp she could remember the exact count of stitches on the baby blanket her aunt had mailed from Tucson. Oren noted the response in a shared spreadsheet, color-coding any symptoms. They had turned healing into fieldwork, but the data comforted Sela, proof of forward motion, cell by cell. By early July, she no longer started the day with a spike of dread. The morning after a particularly sleepless night, Leora's first growth spurt marathon, Sela awoke on the couch and, though groggy, recalled perfectly the lyric Oren had hummed at 3 a.m. to lull the baby. Tiny victories accumulated until she dared venture beyond the neighborhood. She chose the carousel on Caras Park for their first family outing, reasoning that even if a fog descended, the painted horses and calliope music would make a fail-proof landmark. Under the striped pavilion, Oren placed Leora in the smallest saddle, bracing her with both hands while Sela perched beside them. The carousel lurched into motion, organ music scattering like pennies on pavement, and for a heartbeat, Sela felt her vision tunnel, a flash of altitude panic sparked by the spinning world. She closed her eyes, named anchors aloud. Lilac mural, cardamom bakery, B-flat bridge. The vertigo receded before Oren even noticed. When the ride stopped, Sela exhaled a shaky laugh and kissed the top of Leora's cotton hat, breathing milk and sunshine and the faint varnish of carousel paint until the world steadied. Word of their survival story reached local papers after Dr. Kavanagh submitted a case briefed to a neurology journal. Reporters requested interviews. Oren deflected most, but one science writer's curiosity aligned with Sela's desire to turn ordeal into advocacy. In the article, Sela spoke about HAA, high-altitude amnestic response, as a cautionary tale for climbers and field scientists, but also as testament to the brain's ability to rewire with the right stimuli. The piece ran with a photo Oren took. Sela holding Leora in the cottage garden, lavender stems bending under the baby's clenched fist. The caption read, "Memory regrows like a garden if you feed it light." The article brought an unexpected letter from the Helena Botanical Council, offering funding to expand her orchid research into clinical trials. Oren, once a contractor for remote wilderness restoration, saw a bridge between his logistics skills and her science. Evenings became strategy sessions, drafting grant proposals while Leora slept in a basket at their feet. They envisioned a nonprofit greenhouse in Missoula, where alpine and desert species would hybridize under controlled oxygen gradients, each seedling a hypothesis for future medicine. The plan felt audacious, but audacity had already saved them once. Not every day was triumph. On a muggy Thursday in mid-July, Sela experienced her first city-side lapse. She was stacking laundry when a whistle in her ears signaled memory shear, the sense of stepping through a curtain and finding the set rearranged. She stared at a row of onesies, their tiny sleeves fluttering in the fan's breeze, and for a terrifying 30 seconds could not recall who they belonged to. Panic rose, thick and choking, until Leora, in her bouncer, squealed and kicked. The sound snapped a thread, and recognition flooded back. Sela sank to the floor, clutching the baby against her heart, repeating aloud the anchors of their lowland life until tears washed the tremor away. She documented the lapse in the notebook, flagged it for Dr. Kavanaugh, and added an addendum. Urban cues held. Episode resolved in under 1 minute. Oren returned from the hardware store to find mother and child dozing in a nest of folded laundry. He read the entry, kissed Sela's forehead, and whispered that a single minute of forgetting was not failure. Just another data point, another seam for the healing alloy of their days to fuse. August's first week brought heat lightning that flicked across evening clouds. On one such night, the ranger service called. A crew had reached the cabin to log damage. The snow had melted, revealing the radio mast in twisted repose, and the cabin intact beneath a sagging roof. They had found the message on the door, left with spring, back with summer, and wanted instructions. Oren glanced at Sela. Her eyes glistened with longing but no regret. She dictated a list. Rescue the lab samples, bring down the journals she had left in a sealed tin, leave the furniture for the next wanderer in need of shelter. She asked that the door be relatched with a new note. Trail open. Memories kept. September arrived with cool mornings and a first attempt at a family hike on a foothill trail safely under the altitude cap. Sela carried Leora in a chest carrier, feeling the baby's breath feather against her collarbone. Oren pointed out bare grass tufts and patches of serviceberry, narrating the ecosystem like an intimate friend. At a meadow overlook, they paused. The sun caught Sela's earring and flung a tiny prism across Leora's cheek. The baby squealed, reaching for the dancing color, and Sela realized she would remember this image even if every notebook burned. The prism, the high summer grass, Oren's hand steadying her elbow as though he could balance the whole world on that single point of contact. That night, after Leora finally surrendered to sleep, they sat on the back step beneath a sky strewn with the first hints of autumn constellations. Sela leaned into Oren and confessed that part of her feared the brain's next misfire might erase not minutes but months. He turned her wrist upward, tracing the faint puncture scars from the infusion line. Then we'll write it all down again, he said. We'll make more holoclips, fill another notebook, coax the story into every medium until it becomes the air around us. She believed him. The mountain had taught them that love was not a static memory, but a renewable resource, sparked each time they chose to narrate their shared existence. In the quiet, they planned a spring pilgrimage, no higher than 5,000 feet, to scatter native orchid seeds along a rehabilitated trail. Leora would toddle by then, leaving chaotic footprints in new soil. Sela imagined her daughter's laughter ricocheting between cedars, a living anchor no wipe of memory could erase. She pressed Oren's palm and tapped twice. Pause, tap, stay, breathe, live. And he answered in kind. Above them, Orion tipped over the horizon, a reminder that even distant stars rise anew, retelling their story night after night for anyone willing to look up and trust the pattern. April returned, carrying a softness no one would mistake for the harsh, glittering brilliance of the ridge. In the valley, the season moved more like a suggestion than a decree. Tulip shoots nudging through thawed flower beds, river ice slipping its moorings in slow porcelain sheets, daylight lingering just long enough to pink the undersides of scattered clouds. On one such mild evening, Sela stood before the wide greenhouse windows of the newly dedicated Bronte Vale Botanical Alliance Center. Her daughter balanced on her hip and exhaled a breath that fogged the glass only briefly before warm humidity swallowed it. Inside, rows of hydroponic troughs glimmered under spectrum-tuned LEDs, an artificial sunrise engineered to mimic the surge of UV that ghost orchids would receive on their mountain ledges. Lyra, nearly 9 months old now, pressed both palms to the pane, squealing at the wash of colored light. Sela kissed the dark whirl of hair that always escaped her daughter's ponytail and whispered the names of the seedlings to her as though to an eager graduate student. Phalaenopsis montana, Dendrophylax learae, the research team's tongue-in-cheek nod to their smallest collaborator, and the hard-won hybrid registered only last week with the Royal Horticultural Society. Vale's phoenix, a bloom the exact shade of dawn over snow. The plant's rooted not in soil, but in aerated mist laced with a dilute solution of the same peptide compound that had patched her own neural webs. Behind them, Oren's voice rolled down the mezzanine, equal parts tour guide and proud farmer. He pointed out ventilation stacks, recited CO2 uptake rates, explained how a small bank of Metaplast panels, recovered from their cabin outpost and shipped south by the ranger crew, now served as the test wall for self-repair trials under controlled humidity. He told visitors, university donors, and a smattering of journalists that this facility embodied a vow. Knowledge rescued under hardship must be shared widely, or it fossilized into legend instead of blooming into practice. Salah listened with half an ear, lost in a private reel of images. Oren scrambling up the cabin roof to clear the stovepipe, the neon pink motel sign blinking through hospital curtains. Leora's first breath echoing off tiled walls. All of it felt improbably proximal, as though memory had finally settled into orderly layers she could page through, rather than clutches she fought to hold. The orchid peptide regimen had tapered to monthly doses. Dr. Kavanagh declared her hippocampal scans boringly normal. Yet Selah kept certain rituals. Daily entries in a new weather-resistant journal, periodic cognitive drills disguised as storytelling games with Leora, and the Morse code taps she and Oren traded whenever they passed one another in busy corridors. When the tour ended, the visitors collected at the observation deck for photographs. Oren excused himself, sidestepping cameras, and joined Selah at the window. He lifted Leora, settling her on his shoulders in a single practice swoop. The baby cackled, tiny fists clutching his hair like reins. "The board loved the hybrid," he said, voice pitched low for her ears only. "They're wondering if we can ramp up enough tissue culture to send prototypes to the spaceflight trial this fall." Selah considered the rows of fluttering leaves. "Tell them patience grows stronger roots. We ship only what survives a second season." She tipped her head, brushing her temple against his arm in silent apology for the scientist's answer. Oren grinned, unfazed. He had translated her caution into budgets before. They left the greenhouse as evening gathered its violet shawl over Missoula. Streetlights blinked awake, each halo mirrored in puddles from an afternoon sprinkle. They strolled 3 blocks to the cottage that still felt more sanctuary than house, passing yards where children chalked hopscotch grids across cracked sidewalks. Inside, dinner simmered. Quinoa pilaf spiked with diced vegetables grown in the greenhouse's education pod. Leora plucked chilled cucumber slices from her tray while Selah spread field reports across the kitchen table. A ranger's note confirming that snowmelt on Ember Ridge had exposed the last of the fallen scaffolding. Another from the Helena Botanical Council approving funding for a low-altitude orchid preserve along the Bitterroot foothills, so high-risk hikers could experience rare blooms without climbing into danger. After dishes, they bathed Leora in lavender-scented suds, marveling again. How could a child who once fit along Selah's forearm now splash tidal waves that soaked the bathroom rug? Once the baby slept, they retreated to the back patio. Stars pricked the sky, sharp and numerous yet gentler than the knife-bright constellations over the ridge. Oren poured 2 mugs of mint tea. Selah set her journal on her lap, opened to a blank page, and hesitated over the date. "With spring," she murmured, echoing the cabin door inscription. "We're here. No rescue countdown, no altitude restrictions, no hospital bracelets." Oren's hand closed over hers, guiding pen to paper. "Then what does the first summer chapter need?" She thought of the cabin door left unlocked, ready for another wanderer. She thought of students who would file through their greenhouse next week, wide-eyed at the notion that an orchid could double as medicine. She wrote in deliberate strokes, "If you wake tomorrow and the shapes blur, breathe the scent of mint from this garden, listen for the hum of downtown traffic, trace the scar at Oren's eyebrow, feel Leora's heartbeat under her pajamas. These are your mountains now. Learn them the way you learned snow, by walking, by naming, by loving until the map outlives the fog." She set the pen down. Oren tapped her wrist twice. "Stay," and she answered. Wind teased new maple leaves overhead, a softer version of the ridge's pine roar, but carrying the same promise. Weather changes, and living things bend instead of break. Later, as they closed the patio door, Selah paused in the hallway where her field notebooks lined a shelf. Some battered by snow, others still mint from stationery stores. She slid the latest volume beside its predecessors, A continuum of handwriting that no longer felt fragile. A distant rumble of spring thunder vibrated the window panes. She traded a glance with Oren and saw no flash of fear in either of their faces. Storms would come, memory might quake, but the story had matured past the point of shattering. Upstairs, Leora stirred, emitting a sleepy warble that sounded exactly like the opening note of a mountain jay. Sela climbed the steps two at a time, lifted her daughter, and rocked her by the nursery window until the thunder faded. She pressed a kiss into baby-soft hair and whispered the family's favorite code. Two taps, pause, tap, across the curve of her tiny spine. Leora settled instantly, and Sela felt, in her bones, the solidity of a future built on repeating miracles. Breath renewed, love relearned, and memory rewritten as often as life required.